Before empires clashed on a blood-soaked plain, the Balkans fractured into warring shadows of what once was. When Murad's Ottoman host marched north in 1389, Prince Lazar faced an impossible choice: unite feuding Serbian lords or watch his world dissolve beneath a rising tide. On Kosovo Polje, two armies collided in fury: Janissaries against armored knights, Crescent against Cross, discipline against desperate courage. Both sultans fell, both coalitions shattered. Yet from the dust emerged a truth neither side anticipated. This was no ending, but a threshold. The medieval Balkans died that June morning, and from its ashes a new order began its rise. Warm winds rolled across the valleys of the central Balkans in the late 14th century, carrying the scent of fields still untouched by war villages stirred at dawn, much as they had for generations, with herders driving flocks toward pasture, and traders moving along narrow roads between stone-built market towns. Yet beneath this everyday rhythm, something older and more fragile was beginning to rupture. Lords who once bowed to a single crown now watched only their own borders. Merchants whispered about shifting allegiances. Even the monks copying manuscripts in hillside monasteries could feel the tremor of a world rearranging itself. Across this unsettled landscape, the memory of a once unified Serbian realm still lingered in ruined fortresses and abandoned imperial estates under Dušan the Mighty. Its boundaries had stretched wide enough to rival older powers. His sudden death had left the empire without an anchor, and each passing year pulled the fabric of that polity further apart. Lords who had once rallied to a single banner now kept their own courts, their own levies, and their own ambitions. Patrols that once marched in coordinated rotations now guarded only the roads leading to their particular holdings. The unity that had shaped an era was collapsing into regional rule, each fragment responding to its own pressures and fears. Amid this unraveling, border raids added strain to every frontier. Columns of riders appeared without warning along mountain passes and river crossings, their movements blurring the line between reconnaissance and plunder. These strikes were not yet full-scale invasions, but they carried a message. Another power was watching, testing, and waiting. News of each incursion traveled quickly, along forest paths, through churchyards, to the halls of nobles who already felt the weight of responsibility on overstretched shoulders. Some sent envoys seeking alliances, others fortified riverbanks, or summoned levies earlier than usual. All understood that these episodes were harbingers rather than isolated events. Farther south, the Byzantine domains, once the bulwark of the region, were weakening beyond repair. Towns that had once looked to Constantinople for protection now relied on their own walls. Their rulers struggled to gather enough troops even for local defense. With the empire's authority shrinking, old boundaries lost meaning. Mountain lordships and coastal enclaves drifted into competing orbits, leaving the land between them exposed to forces rising from Anatolia. What had been a patchwork of states was shifting into something more precarious. A region in which no single authority could guarantee stability. It was within this widening gap that the Ottoman frontier system expanded. Garrison towns along the Maritsa and further west became hubs of patrols that crossed into Christian-held territories in swift, probing arcs. Some detachments returned with captives or livestock. Others mapped routes, tested watchposts, or gauged the response time of local forces. These activities were subtle on the surface, yet cumulative in effect. Each ride deepened the presence of a new power on European soil, a presence that no longer seemed temporary. Rumors of new fortifications in Thrace and Macedonia circulated among merchants. Border officers noticed disciplined patterns in the enemy's movements. evidence of command rather than random raiding. In this unsettled world, one figure began to gather significance: Lazar Rebeljanović, a lord of central Serbian territories. He had inherited neither a vast domain nor a direct imperial legacy. What he possessed instead was a talent for building alliances and a temperament suited for a time when diplomacy mattered as much as arms. From his strongholds among the Morava valleys, he worked to stabilize a region that might otherwise fall entirely into disunity. Travelers approaching his court at Kruševac found a place alive with activity. Messengers arriving from neighboring nobles, visiting craftsmen expanding fortifications, and clerics moving between monasteries carrying letters sealed with his emblem. Lazar's consolidation efforts were not simple. Some neighboring lords welcomed cooperation. Others watched him with suspicion. Rivalries among the descendants of former magnates still simmered. To strengthen his position, Lazar forged ties through marriage, negotiation, and calculated support during disputes between other nobles. These alliances allowed him to secure roads, rebuild damaged strongholds, and collect revenues from territories that had once drifted beyond organized authority. Each agreement expanded the influence of his court, stitching together lands that had been left aimless by imperial collapse. Among the nobles whose ambitions shaped the region, Vuk Branković stood out. His holdings lay across routes linking Kosovo, Macedonia, and the interior. His influence grew as old borders faded, and his choices, whether to cooperate with Lazar or act independently, carried weight. Their relationship required constant management, cooperation when threats loomed, caution when ambitions clashed. Between them, a tense balance formed, one defined not by trust, but by shared recognition that no single lord could face rising pressures alone. To the west, Nikola Altomanović controlled territories around the Drina and Lim valleys. His strongholds commanded passes essential for trade and military movement, making him a formidable figure. His decisions shaped the security of broad stretches of land. When alliances shifted or conflicts erupted, his realm often stood at their center. Struggles involving him forced other nobles to choose sides, and those choices carried long-term consequences for the already fragile geopolitical landscape. Disputes between Altomanović and his rivals rippled outward, creating temporary coalitions and leaving lasting grievances. Throughout these years, early clashes with Ottoman raiding parties added urgency to every calculation. Some encounters ended quickly, with local defenders driving off small bands. Others resulted in burned fields or abducted villagers. These skirmishes revealed the limits of fragmented authority. No single lord could mount a response consistent enough to deter further incursions. Scouts began reporting movements that suggested more organized pressure, a shift from opportunistic raiding toward planned expansion. Each report reached Lazar's court with the same implication: time was running short. Meanwhile, the leadership emerging in the Ottoman domains was taking shape under Murad I. His rule solidified networks of vassals in Bulgaria and among certain Serbian lords who, out of necessity or calculation, accepted Ottoman authority in exchange for retaining local control. These agreements built the foundation of a system that could project military power deep into the Balkans. In towns under his influence, garrisons trained regularly, supply depots expanded, and commanders coordinated frontier actions with growing precision. Riders loyal to Murad crossed rivers and mountain passes with increasing confidence, marking the reach of a state that no longer felt distant. Murad's aims appeared in the way his forces moved, patiently, methodically, and with a strategic understanding of weaknesses among his neighbors. As local Balkan rulers contended with internal rivalries, his commanders mapped their fragmentation. As Byzantine authority shrank, his networks filled the vacuum. The quiet establishment of outposts, the negotiated submission of certain nobles, and the steady rhythm of raids preserved pressure without triggering immediate large-scale resistance. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Preparation for deeper campaigns was underway. By the late 1380s, incidents between Serbian forces and Ottoman detachments grew more frequent. Some confrontations were brief and inconclusive. Others hinted at the scale of conflict approaching from the south. Messages sent between courts spoke of increasing tension and uncertainty. Levies were summoned earlier in the season, fortifications were repaired, and scouts watched southern routes day and night. Each noble understood that these escalations would not remain isolated for long. Gradually, the sense of inevitability settled over the Balkans. Disputes among local rulers continued, but the urgency of a greater threat began to overshadow them. Rumors of a major Ottoman mobilization circulated in trading towns, monasteries, and fortified courts. Those who rode the length of the Morava valleys or crossed the plains of Kosovo could sense that the region stood on the threshold of something decisive. Armies were gathering, alliances forming under pressure, and the delicate balance of power that had shaped the previous generation was nearing its end. When the first confirmed reports arrived that Murad was assembling a vast host for a new campaign, no one doubted the destination. Every road, every river crossing, every fortified manor pointed toward the same conclusion. The breaking tensions of the Balkans were drawing all forces toward a single field, one where the fate of the region would be tested in open battle. Even as rumors of a rising campaign spread, life in the hill forts and market towns carried on with a strange mixture of routine and apprehension. Messengers moved between courts at a pace that betrayed urgency, their horses driven hard across forest tracks that once carried only caravans and clerics. In monasteries overlooking the Morava valleys, elders debated what the shifting alliances meant for the future of a land whose unity had vanished within a single generation. Across every district, people sensed that the fragile balance holding the region together could not endure much longer. At the center of this changing world, Lazar continued shaping his expanding realm with careful intention. His court, alive with planning and negotiation, worked to counter the vacuum left by earlier imperial collapse. Envoys arrived bearing reports from river crossings, frontier watchtowers, and villages sitting uncomfortably close to the paths used by Ottoman raiders. Each message added to a map of pressures tightening from the south and east. Rather than respond with rash mobilization, Lazar focused first on securing internal stability, knowing that unresolved local tensions would give any invader an easy advantage. Maintaining equilibrium among regional nobles required constant patience. Long-standing rivalries did not simply disappear under the threat of invasion. Some lords guarded old grudges as fiercely as their fortresses. Others hesitated to commit forces without assurances about land rights or influence after the crisis passed. Lazar spent months weaving together agreements that kept volatile alliances intact. Agreements sealed through marriages, shared campaigns against troublesome neighbors, and demonstrations of strength at critical moments. Through this steady work, fragmented territories began moving in coordinated patterns, even if still driven by self-interest. Meanwhile, Vuk Brankovic watched events unfold from his strongholds across Kosovo and beyond. His position along vital roads gave him leverage few could ignore. Every caravan bound for Skopje or the Adriatic coast passed through stretches of land under his authority. His role in the region had grown complex, part rival, part ally, always decisive. When word reached him of rising pressure from the south, he strengthened border posts and reinforced stone towers that surveyed the plains. Though cooperation with Lazar was necessary, he never let go of the ambition to shape the region's future according to his own interests. Conflicts to the west also affected the fragile order. Nikola Altomanovich's political maneuvering created ripples that forced neighboring nobles into difficult choices. His control of mountain passes and river valleys placed him squarely between competing claims, and disputes involving him often ended in bloody confrontations. Whenever rivalries flared, they left behind weakened strongholds, displaced retainers, and resentment that would resurface in future crises. The instability he contributed made the Balkan interior more vulnerable to outside pressure. Even as nobles worked to contain the consequences of his actions, these internal dynamics played out while Ottoman frontier networks continued tightening. Scouts from local households reported unfamiliar movements around the edges of settled lands, small detachments traveling light and fast, appearing briefly before vanishing into mountain fog or dense forest. Their presence created unease far beyond the sites of actual clashes. Villagers abandoned isolated farms. Traders altered routes to avoid exposed crossings. Siege engineers in newly fortified towns questioned whether their walls could withstand the siege devices rumored to accompany Ottoman campaigns. Each encounter deepened a sense of vulnerability that no alliance of local lords could fully dispel. Murad's rule shaped these developments with quiet determination. His influence spread gradually, often through negotiated relationships rather than outright conquest. Some neighboring rulers entered into vassalage to secure their positions, trading autonomy for survival. Such arrangements tied the Balkans into a network that extended from the Anatolian plateau to the Danube basin. Troops raised in distant provinces marched alongside Christian contingents, bound to the Sultan by treaty. Supplies flowed through fortified corridors, connecting new garrisons. These patterns revealed a leadership capable of long-term planning, a reality not lost on those watching from the fractured Serbian lands. Each passing season brought signs that the Ottoman presence was no longer confined to border raids. Commanders tested defenses with deliberate precision. Larger formations drilled near river crossings that mark the threshold between spheres of influence. New fortifications rose along routes leading toward the interior. Even without open war, the frontier felt increasingly permeable. For nobles responsible for defending their domains, this shift signaled that the region was being prepared for something far larger than the episodic incursions of previous years. Across the Christian courts, messengers carried copies of agreements, appeals for reinforcements, and warnings of raids that probed deeper into inhabited territories. Some accounts described fields burned at harvest time, a tactic meant to weaken a region before any major invasion. Others spoke of detachments moving with unusual discipline, avoiding unnecessary skirmishes as if preserving strength for an impending campaign. These patterns hinted at a broader strategy unfolding just beyond the horizon. Such tensions encouraged renewed cooperation between nobles whose rivalries had once defined the political landscape. Disputes were not forgotten, but they were increasingly overshadowed by the recognition that no single lord could halt the advance spreading from the south. Lazar's envoys traveled between courts seeking coordinated action, while Brankovich's representatives navigated fragile negotiations meant to balance autonomy with collective defense. Even realms farther west began watching events more closely, aware that the repercussions of a major clash would reach far beyond Serbia's borders. Villagers in Kosovo and along the Morava valleys observed changes as well. Roads saw more armored riders than traders. blacksmiths labored over spearheads and horseshoes at a pace that suggested war preparations. Priests offered blessings over levies summoned earlier than expected. Rumors drifted from one settlement to another. Stories of full armies mustering near fortified Ottoman towns, of new commanders arriving from distant provinces, of lordships submitting under pressure before any large-scale conflict erupted. Though these stories varied, they carried a common message. A storm was forming. When scouts finally brought confirmation that a vast host was gathering under Murad's command, the region's lingering hopes for delay evaporated. Every noble who received the news understood that fragmented defenses would not withstand the force approaching from the south. Conversation in strongholds and monasteries turned from speculation to preparation. The alliances Lazar had cautiously assembled would soon be tested on ground chosen not by local rulers, but by the advancing army itself. Across river valleys, mountain passes, and the fertile plains of Kosovo, anticipation settled like a shadow. Armies drew nearer with each passing week, and the land that had seen decades of fragmentation was being pulled toward a single confrontation. Whatever old rivalries persisted, whatever uncertain loyalties remained, all would be swept into the conflict gathering on the horizon. The forces that had shaped the Balkans for a generation were converging, and the decisive moment for the region approached with the steady certainty of an army on the march. Spring settled over Thrace in a season that felt unusually busy. Roads leading toward the great encampments near Edirne echoed with the movement of thousands, pack mules laden with grain, columns of foot soldiers marching in rhythm, riders carrying sealed orders between commanders scattered across the frontier. For months, rumors had whispered of a new campaign, but the scale unfolding across the plains left no doubt. Murad I was assembling a force meant to push deeper into the Balkans than any previous expedition. Within the sprawling Ottoman camp, tents stretched in long rows, broken only by the occasional pavilion of a provincial commander. Smoke from cook fires drifted over supply wagons, while armourers hammered dents from helmets and fitted fresh rivets to lamella plates. The sounds of preparation carried far beyond the camp's perimeter. Those passing along nearby roads could hear shouted commands, the clatter of weapons drilled in formation, and the uneven rhythm of horses being trained for the long march ahead. Every movement suggested a leadership planning more than another probing raid. Murad moved through this gathering host with deliberate calm. Retainers cleared a path wherever he passed, yet his presence blended into the controlled activity rather than towering above it. He understood the importance of steady leadership in a force drawn from multiple provinces, each contingent bringing different customs, equipment, and expectations. Troops from the Anatolian plateau camped near detachments raised in Rumelia. Veterans who had marched under the Sultan in earlier campaigns exchanged advice with younger warriors experiencing their first major muster. Despite these differences, all moved according to a structured plan that pointed toward a single goal. Orders flowed outward from the command tent each morning. Some directed garrisons in Thrace to ready bridging equipment for river crossings. Others instructed regional governors to secure grain stores for the march north. Farther afield, messengers summoned contingents from distant frontier beyliks. Their arrivals staggered so that supply routes would not clog under sudden pressure. Artisans traveled with the army, tasked with maintaining weapons along the route. Engineers prepared to reinforce roads and riverbanks that would bear the weight of troops and wagons. Everything suggested that this expedition was designed to sustain itself far from home. Diverse elements gathered into the growing host. Light cavalry from the western provinces arrived first. accustomed to moving quickly through rugged terrain. Their composite bows and nimble horses made them ideal scouts and flankers. Infantry units followed, including Azeb formations trained for versatile roles from guarding artillery to holding firm in chaotic engagements. Sipahi riders, feudal cavalry granted land in exchange for military service, joined them in polished armor that reflected the ambition of their rank. Behind them came detachments of janissaries, the elite household troops raised under the Sultan's direct authority. Their discipline stood out in the camp: straight lines, synchronized drills, and a silence that set them apart even amid the clamor. Among these forces marched vassal contingents from Balkan territories, already under Ottoman suzerainty. Commanders from these lands understood the stakes. Their survival hinged on aligning with a power that had grown too strong to contest. Their riders carried local banners alongside those of the Sultan, a sight that affirmed Murad's diplomatic success in weaving submission into expansion. These units added both manpower and strategic familiarity, for they knew the river valleys, highland passes, and fortified towns that marked the northern routes. Securing the march itself required careful planning. Roads along the Maritsa were inspected and repaired where winter storms had washed away. Sections, watchposts were reinforced in towns behind the main host, forming a chain of communication that extended all the way to Edirne. Supply officers calculated how fast the army could advance without exhausting the countryside. For weeks before departure, barges filled with grain and equipment floated upriver to meet the advancing troops at designated checkpoints. Even minor details, how many smiths would be needed for the march, how many oxen required for heavy wagons, had been accounted for before the first banner lifted from the main camp. As this vast machine prepared to move, word spread rapidly across the Balkans. Traders crossing the Rhodope passes reported seeing columns of soldiers stretching beyond the horizon. Fishermen along the southern Danube heard that Thracian garrisons had emptied to join the expedition. Priests in towns near Sofia warned parishioners to gather supplies, for armies, no matter their allegiance, took what they needed on campaign. These stories traveled northward, reaching courts that had watched Ottoman expansion for years, but had not yet faced a mobilization of this magnitude. Among those receiving such reports, Lazar and his advisors listened with growing concern. Scouts he dispatched returned with consistent conclusions. The approaching force was too large for any single Balkan lord to confront alone. Each new messenger brought further confirmation. Fresh units from Asia joining the march, commanders with experience in sieges traveling near the vanguard, and vassal detachments swelling the already significant host. The realization settled over Lazar's court with a weight that no one present could ignore. Even nobles previously hesitant to align with Lazar sensed the danger. Some whose loyalties had wavered now sent messages offering cooperation, hoping to avoid isolation when the campaign reached their doorstep. Others quietly fortified their estates, uncertain whether the coming conflict would allow time for negotiation. The fragile coalition forming around Lazar owed much to the increasing urgency. Options were narrowing, with each league the Ottoman host advanced. While Christian courts debated strategy, Murad's march continued northward. The army moved with controlled precision, halting near fortified towns whose defenses had little hope of resisting such a force. Detachments secured roads branching west toward Macedonia and east toward Bulgarian strongholds, ensuring that no hostile troops could threaten the supply routes. Villages along the way watched the passing columns in silence, the scale of the march leaving little room for resistance. In some areas, local lords sent representatives bearing gifts to demonstrate loyalty, purchasing security through submission rather than force. Murad's sons played visible roles in this campaign. One commanded the left flank, responsible for scouting wide arcs around the main body. The other led units positioned on the right, ensuring that roads from the Adriatic hinterlands remained secure. Their presence reinforced the legitimacy of a dynasty consolidating its reach. Soldiers within their ranks carried themselves with the confidence of troops who believed in the inevitability of victory. These commanders had studied their father's approach to expansion, steady, methodical, and unrelenting. As the march advanced deeper into Balkan territory, the scale of the undertaking became evident even to those far removed from the centers of power. Caravans moving through merchant towns noticed an unusual number of military requisitions. Monasteries housed travelers fleeing regions already passed by. The Ottoman host, farmers, reported seeing distant dust clouds rising from the movement of thousands. Even those who lived in secluded valleys sensed the coming clash, for the patterns of ordinary life were disrupted by the steady echo of armies in motion. By early summer, Murad's host entered territory within reach of the central plains. Scouts rode ahead to locate sources of water, identify potential campsites, and ensure that the final approach would not be hindered by obstacles. Behind them came the disciplined ranks upon which the Sultan relied to secure victory, a force drawn from across continents, bound by command and expectation. As they neared their destination, the rhythm of the march slowed only slightly, allowing trailing units to rejoin before the final stage. When the Ottoman banners first appeared on the approaches leading toward Kosovo, the message carried through every surrounding valley. The campaign that nobles had whispered about for months was no longer a possibility, but an undeniable reality. Murad's march had reached the heart of the Balkans, and the decisive confrontation that had hovered over the region was at last coming into sight. As Murad's columns advanced toward the central Balkans, villages along the route faced choices that carried lasting consequences. Some communities shut their gates and hid supplies in forest clearings, hoping the army would pass without notice. Others opened their markets, reasoning that showing hospitality might spare them harsher treatment. In towns loyal to the Sultan, processions greeted the soldiers with offerings of bread, salt, and wine. Even these gestures carried an undercurrent of tension, for no one knew how long the great host would remain, or what demands its commanders might make. Within the moving army, daily life settled into an organized rhythm. Dawn began with cooks lighting fires to prepare meals from grain brought in wagons or requisitioned along the way. Engineers inspected bridges used by the vanguard to ensure they could sustain the weight of advancing cavalry. Farther back, scribes recorded the distribution of supplies with meticulous care, for shortages could derail a campaign of this scale. The infantry marched in long columns that snaked through valleys and across plains, their steady pace setting the tempo for the rest of the host. Light cavalry units rode far ahead of the main force. They followed routes that avoided obvious roads and crossed meadows where hoofbeats were muffled by spring grass. Their task was to gather intelligence, map potential obstacles, and observe whether Christian forces were preparing to meet the army head-on or withdraw into fortified positions. Sometimes these scouts encountered resistance from local retainers defending border estates. Such skirmishes ended quickly, offering both sides only glimpses of the other's tactics. Reports from these encounters shaped Murad's decisions, helping him avoid traps or weak terrain, while guiding the host toward favorable ground. Meanwhile, Janissaries maintained a disciplined order that impressed even seasoned warriors. Their drills continued at midday halts, with officers barking commands that echoed across open fields. Observers noted their calm precision, regardless of the distance covered each day. They marched under standards bearing the Sultan's emblem, an unmistakable symbol of imperial authority. Whenever the host encamped for the night, the Janissaries were positioned near the command pavilion, ensuring Murad's safety and establishing a core of stability around which the rest of the army could organize. Days along the march blended into a pattern of movement, preparation, and vigilance. Yet each stage brought the Ottoman expedition closer to regions that had resisted for decades. In towns loyal to Prince Lazar, travelers from the south described seeing banners from Anatolian provinces intermixed with those of Rumelian contingents. Stories of siege engineers traveling near the vanguard spread quickly. Even if exaggerated, such accounts made clear that the approaching army was not a mere raiding force. It carried all the elements needed for extended operations: heavy infantry, elite household troops, bow-armed cavalry, and leaders experienced in campaign logistics. These reports reached Serbia at a time when alliances remained fragile. Lazar's envoys returned from neighboring courts with mixed results. Some lords agreed to send contingents immediately. Others hesitated, citing conflicts at home or concerns about long-term obligations. Despite these uncertainties, Lazar pressed forward, determined to gather as broad a coalition as possible. His court assessed maps marking roads the Ottoman army would likely follow, river crossings suitable for ambush, and areas where the terrain could be used to blunt Murad's numerical advantage. Advisors debated whether to defend the Morava valleys or lure the enemy toward a field where heavy cavalry might strike with maximum effect. The Bosnian king, engaged elsewhere but aware of the rising danger, responded to Lazar's call by sending experienced forces under the command of Vlatko Vukovic. His contingent, seasoned from earlier clashes with Ottoman commanders, added weight to the emerging alliance. Riders who accompanied Vukovic carried stories of battles fought against frontier detachments, stories of nights spent watching for sudden attacks, and of mornings marked by cautious advances through forests where enemies could hide in silence. Their presence signaled that Bosnia intended to play an active role in resisting Murad's campaign. At the same time, Lazar's son-in-law, Vuk Brankovic, prepared to defend his own domains. His troops assembled across the lands surrounding Kosovo, reinforcing outposts that overlooked plains and foothills. Armorers worked through the night in his strongholds, repairing the heavy cavalry equipment that would be crucial in any confrontation. Brankovic's officers rode to Lazar's court, carrying updates on troop numbers, weapon stores, and the progress of mobilization. Despite occasional tension between their households, both leaders understood that unity was essential. Their cooperation in the coming weeks would shape the fate of the entire region. Across the Christian territories, priests delivered sermons urging steadfastness. Bells rang in fortified towns to summon levies. Men from villages near the Morava and Ibar river valleys joined mustering points, some carrying family heirloom weapons, others receiving spears and shields made just weeks earlier. Women prepared supplies for the march, while elders watched in silence, recalling earlier generations who had defended the same roads from threats now rising once again from the south. Even as preparations intensified, uncertainty lingered. No one knew precisely where Murad would force the decisive battle, only that it would come soon. Meanwhile, the Ottoman host continued its advance with steady momentum. The army moved through Bulgarian lands, held by vassals who provided guides familiar with the terrain. Where roads narrowed between cliffs and riverbanks, soldiers worked to widen paths to allow wagons through. Rivers swollen from spring melts required the construction of makeshift bridges. Everywhere the army went, evidence of careful planning appeared. Nothing suggested haste. Murad's commanders proceeded according to a strategy crafted long before the march began. Scouts returning to the main army brought news of Christian patrols shadowing their movement from the north. These encounters rarely escalated, yet they confirmed that Lazar and his allies had begun concentrating forces. Murad responded by adjusting his formation, ensuring that supply wagons remained protected behind the infantry lines and that cavalry screened the flanks. At each night halt, camp sentries positioned themselves at calculated distances to detect any approaching threat. This system reduced the likelihood of surprise, allowing the host to rest without fear of sudden attack. As summer approached, the landscape changed. Forests thinned, opening onto wide plains where columns could spread out without slowing. This terrain favored large formations and made it easier for Murad's commanders to maintain communication across the breadth of the army. The march continued without the disruptions that plagued smaller forces attempting to traverse the same region. Grain stored in depots ensured that no unit lacked provisions. Artisans repaired wagons damaged by rough ground. Officers inspected armor and weapons at regular intervals. The host marched as a single organism, sustained by infrastructure built through years of expansion. By the time the army turned toward Kosovo-Polje, the plains ahead stretched like an invitation. Scouts reported open terrain, suitable for large-scale maneuvers. Commanders recognized the strategic value of such ground, wide enough for cavalry to operate freely, yet close enough to key routes that victory would shape the region's balance of power. Murad approved the choice without hesitation. After weeks on the march, the army would soon stand on a field where the full strength of his mobilized forces could be brought to bear. When the first lines of Ottoman riders reached the edges of those plains, dust rose in long currents behind them. Officers surveyed the land, marking positions for infantry ranks, artillery, and supply lines. As camp standards unfurled and tents began rising across the open ground, it became clear to all who saw it that the decisive moment long anticipated by the Christian courts had arrived. Murad's host had chosen its ground, and the confrontation that would determine the future of the Balkans was now close at hand. Mist clung to the valley floors as messengers crossed the lands of Moravian Serbia, carrying word that Murad's vast host had reached the threshold of Kosovo. Riders arrived at Kruševac day after day, dust on their cloaks, urgency in their voices, bringing reports that left no room for doubt. The campaign long feared was now unfolding in full force. No fragment of the Balkan nobility could face it alone. Lazar understood this before many others, and his court moved with a purpose shaped by necessity rather than ambition. Inside the stone walls of his stronghold, preparations shifted from deliberation to action. Levies summoned months earlier returned from their home villages with supplies gathered for the march. Officers tallied the forces available: armored household cavalry, retainers drawn from noble estates, archers and infantry raised from lands recently brought under Lazar's influence. Though not as numerous as the advancing Ottoman host, this army held the advantage of discipline and equipment honed across generations of conflict. Despite the urgency, Lazar remained composed. His presence calmed those around him, lending order to a moment that could have easily descended into confusion. Envoys dispatched to neighboring nobles delivered messages that balanced urgency with diplomacy. Some lords responded immediately, sending detachments to join the growing muster around Kruševac. Others hesitated, fearing that committing troops might expose their own lands to attack. Yet the closer Murad drew, the more these uncertainties faded. Even nobles who had once resisted Lazar's authority recognized the need for unity. Riders arrived from mountain estates and plains settlements, carrying banners marked with symbols of old families whose rivalries had shaped the region for years. Among those answering the call, the contingent from Bosnia drew particular attention. Vlatko Vukovic, a seasoned commander, led these troops with the steady confidence of one who knew the danger they faced. His forces carried memories of earlier victories against Ottoman detachments, and their presence added both strength and credibility to the alliance. When they rode into the gathering camp, armored hooves striking sparks on the stone roads, soldiers murmured with renewed hope. Vukovic greeted Lazar with formal respect, yet their exchange carried the unspoken understanding of two leaders preparing for a confrontation that would test every measure of resolve. Still, internal tensions remained. Vuk Brankovic, whose lands stretched across Kosovo and beyond, arrived with a sizable force. His banners, marked by symbols long tied to the region's history, fluttered above lines of armored riders. His presence signaled the importance of the coming battle, though it also introduced delicate challenges. His influence rivaled Lazar's in some areas, and the cooperation between their households required constant negotiation. Even as Brankovic pledged support, officers on both sides knew that balancing authority within the Allied ranks would demand careful handling. The negotiations between these leaders played out in chambers lit by oil lamps, where maps covered long wooden tables. They traced roads running through the hills toward the plains, discussed the positions where the enemy might establish camp, and debated how their combined forces could best hold ground. Some suggested fortifying the approaches and forcing Murad to fight in narrow terrain. Others argued that defensive entrenchments would only invite encirclement by a larger, more mobile enemy. The debate continued late into the nights, each voice reflecting both the experience and anxieties of the men responsible for guiding their armies. As word spread across the region, smaller detachments trickled in from surrounding territories. Some came from nobles who had not fully committed, but feared being left outside a conflict that would shape the Balkans. Others arrived from communities lying directly in the path of the Ottoman advance, sending every able man in hopes of defending their lands. Among them were riders from Albanian hill provinces, warriors from Wallachian border towns, and a handful of retainers from Hungarian or Bohemian families, connected through marriage or past alliances. These contributions varied in size, yet each arrival strengthened the coalition's resolve. Once the main contingents had assembled, the Allied camp around Kruševac took on a life of its own. Smiths set up forges near the riverbank, repairing swords, hammering spearheads, and fitting fresh horseshoes. Armourers inspected breastplates battered from earlier clashes against Ottoman raiders. Wagon masters lined up carts carrying flour, dried meat, firewood, and spare equipment. Priests moved among the tents, offering blessings to men preparing for a battle, whose outcome no one could predict with certainty. The air buzzed with conversations in multiple dialects, each reflecting the region's tangled mosaic of identities. Scouts played a crucial role during these days. They rode south through wooded passes, following trails that merged with the main routes leading toward Kosovo. Their reports confirmed that the Ottoman host continued its march with unbroken momentum. Riders describing the enemy spoke of lines stretching far across the landscape, of disciplined ranks moving without hesitation, of banners marking units drawn from far-off provinces. These accounts carried weight in every council meeting, reminding the leaders that their decisions had to be made quickly but without error. The question of where to confront Murad became central. Lazar's advisors studied the region closely, weighing the strengths of each potential location. Some argued that the plains near Kosovo offered an opportunity for heavy cavalry to strike with force. Others feared that such open terrain favored the Ottoman cavalry, whose agility and numbers could shift the tide. The debate turned to supply lines, how long the Allied forces could remain in the field, where water sources might prove insufficient, and which roads allowed for rapid reinforcement or retreat. Ultimately, the decision hinged on the need to intercept Murad before he reached deeper into Serbian lands. As the march began, the Allied army moved through a countryside bracing for impact. Villagers lined roads to watch armored riders pass, offering bread or water where they could. Some whispered prayers as they saw the long lines of infantry carrying spears and shields. Others stood in silence, their expressions revealing the weight of uncertainty pressing upon them. Few doubted the scale of the conflict approaching from the south, and fewer still believed that the plains ahead would escape the violence gathering at their edges. Along the march, the Allied leaders maintained close communication. Officers carried messages between Lazar, Vukovic, and Brankovic, synchronizing the movement of infantry columns with the progression of heavy cavalry. The terrain occasionally forced them into narrow passages, where the army stretched for miles, but scouts ensured no ambush threatened their path. As they crossed bridges and climbed ridges overlooking the Kosovo basin, the full scale of the land they had come to defend revealed itself. Broad plains bordered by distant hills, dotted with villages whose fate would soon hinge on the coming battle. By the time the Allied forces neared the edges of Kosovo Polje, the atmosphere shifted. Open ground spread before them, a vast expanse where nothing obstructed the horizon. It was here that the confrontation would be decided. Officers surveyed the terrain, marking positions where cavalry might gain momentum, where archers could hold firm, and where reserves could intervene at decisive moments. Every detail mattered. The slightest miscalculation could unravel the unity they had fought so hard to preserve. Before the final positions were chosen, the leaders held a council that stretched long into the night. The flicker of torchlight cast moving shadows across their faces as they weighed the realities before them. Each man understood the consequences. If they held this field, the Balkans would resist another generation of encroachment. If they failed, the lands they governed could fall under a power expanding rapidly across continents. No speech was needed to convey the gravity. The quiet determination in every voice said, "Enough." With dawn approaching, the Allied armies began settling into positions just beyond the plains, where Murad's host would soon appear. Soldiers unrolled bedding, tethered horses, sharpened blades, and exchanged murmured predictions about the battle ahead. In those final hours before the clash, the coalition stood united, not by perfect trust or long-standing harmony, but by the shared understanding that the fate of their world depended on what would happen when both armies finally met on the field of Kosovo. Night settled over the Allied encampment in uneven layers of torchlight and shadow. Fires crackled beside rows of tents, their glow reflected in the polish of helmets laid out for inspection. Men sat in small circles, sharpening blades or whispering to one another about the size of the coming host. Others rested with their backs against shields, the weight of the approaching battle pressing more heavily than any armor. Although the camp stretched across fields and hills, a shared stillness tied every corner together. Anticipation for the dawn when they would march toward the plain that would define their future. In the command tent at the center, leaders gathered around a long table covered in maps. Wax dripped-down candles set between parchment scrolls, and small wooden markers representing the positions of their forces. Lazar listened, as officers discussed adjustments for tomorrow's movement. How far forward scouts should ride, where the columns should split before rejoining at the plain, and which units to place closest to the vanguard. Each voice carried the weight of experience, drawn from years of border skirmishes and earlier victories against Ottoman detachments. Yet this time, the stakes felt entirely different. Outside, Brankovich's officers discussed the formations of their cavalry. Many of his riders came from territories closest to the Ottoman advance, giving them a clear sense of what the first clashes might bring. They moved among their soldiers, checking straps on saddles and measuring the length of lances. The conversations were quiet but firm, focusing on discipline during the charge. A single moment of hesitation or misalignment could unravel even the strongest formation. Their preparations had the intensity of men who knew they would soon face enemies in far greater numbers. Vukovic's Bosnians maintained their own part of the camp, their banners marking a distinct section filled with the sounds of commanders giving final instructions. Their seasoned infantry cleaned shields battered from earlier encounters along the frontier. Archers inspected the grain of their bow staves, testing the tension with slow, deliberate pulls. This contingent, though smaller than the core Serbian force, carried a reputation earned through battles where retreat had not been an option. As night deepened, they moved with the calm determination of fighters who had long expected a moment like this. Along the outskirts of the camp, priests visited clusters of soldiers. Many men sought blessings before sleep, stretching out their hands as prayers rose into the cold air. Some placed keepsakes, small wooden crosses, tokens from family, or bits of cloth tied at the wrist into their tunics for protection. Others knelt quietly behind their tents, offering their own private words. No one spoke loudly. Even those with confidence kept their voices low, as if acknowledging that too much bravado would feel out of place under the weight of what awaited them. Scouts set out before midnight. They rode with minimal gear, relying on knowledge of the terrain more than their weapons. Their route followed narrow forest trails southward, cutting across ridgelines that overlooked potential enemy approaches. The darkness made navigation difficult, yet these men had spent years learning the shape of the land. They were tasked not only with locating the Ottoman vanguard, but also with understanding how fast the enemy moved. The coalition needed that information to finalize their own deployment. When the scouts disappeared into the trees, their departure marked the last outward motion before the camp sank into silence. Dawn approached slowly. First came the sound of horses shifting in their tethers, responding to faint changes in the air. Then the camp stirred as the first line of tents caught the pale light of morning. Officers moved quickly through the rows, rousing units and calling men to assemble. Fires were rekindled, and breakfast was kept brief. Bread, dried fruit, and water. Each soldier checked his equipment for the third or fourth time. Buckles tightened, straps retied, blades inspected for cracks. The practical details of readiness helped steady nerves. When the scouts returned shortly after sunrise, their reports carried urgency. Murad's host moved with relentless discipline. The vanguard had already reached the final ridges overlooking the Kosovo basin. Observers had counted lines stretching across slopes, marked by glinting metal and banners of multiple provinces. The sound of their march, drums, neighing horses, and the rumble of wagons had reached the scouts long before the army itself came into view. Hearing this, Lazar's commanders exchanged glances that conveyed both resolve and the gravity of the task ahead. The decision was made quickly. The coalition would move to meet Murad on the plain before the Ottoman army could dictate the exact terms of the engagement. Forming lines under pressure, risked chaos. Preparing positions in advance offered the Allies their best chance of holding firm. Drums signaled the order, and the army began its march in practiced formation. Infantry moved along the central route, while cavalry rode parallel paths to allow room for maneuver. Brankovich's riders maintained a careful distance from Vukovic's troops, not out of hostility, but because each wing needed clear space to prepare for its role in the coming battle. As the columns descended toward Kosovo Polje, the vastness of the land unfolded before them. The plains stretched wide under the morning light, framed by low hills and dotted with distant villages. This open ground could amplify the strength of heavy cavalry, but it also exposed them to archery and flanking movements if discipline faltered. Officers pointed out key features: the rise where reserves might stand ready, the shallow depressions that could hide infantry movement, the gentle slope that would serve as the coalition's center. Every detail mattered now. Before establishing final positions, the leaders paused at a hill overlooking the plain. The silence between them held more meaning than any discussion of tactics. They could already sense the faint tremor of the approaching Ottoman host, a pulse that seemed to ripple through the earth itself. From this vantage point, the Allied commanders committed fully to the reality ahead. Retreat was no longer an option. The land before them would bear the weight of both armies within hours. Once the coalition claimed its chosen ground, soldiers set about the final tasks, arranging lines, digging shallow trenches where needed, placing shields and weapons within easy reach, and positioning horses behind the front ranks. Officers walked the length of the formations, making sure that each man understood his place. There was no room for confusion. The rhythm of preparation settled into the army like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, unbroken. Near midday, a hush fell across the Allied lines. In the distance, dust rose in long plumes, carried upward by thousands of feet. Dark shapes emerged from beyond the far ridges, forming patterns that shifted and expanded as more troops appeared. Standards bearing symbols from across Murad's realms caught the sunlight. Columns of cavalry fanned out along the edges of the plain. Janissaries advanced near the center, moving with the precision of troops whose purpose never wavered. The sight confirmed everything the scouts had reported, and more. The Allied army watched without speaking. Even seasoned fighters felt a tightening in their chests as the full scale of Murad's force became clear. Yet alongside the fear came determination. Every man standing on that plain understood why he was there, not for glory, not for ambition, but because retreat would mean surrendering their homes, their families, and the fragile independence still holding the Balkans together. As the sun reached its height, both armies faced one another across the vast sweep of Kosovo Polje. The ground between them lay silent for now, but its stillness hinted at the violence it would soon contain. Behind the front ranks, officers exchanged final messages, ensuring that each wing, each center formation, each reserve understood its role. When the moment came, the alliance would meet Murad's army head-on, not as fragmented principalities, but as a united force bound by necessity and resolve. By late afternoon, everything stood in place. Shields aligned, banners lifted, horses tethered for the opening charge. The tension hanging over the plain felt almost physical, as if the air itself resisted movement. Tomorrow, the armies would collide. Tonight, the Allied coalition held the lines they had chosen, watching the gathering storm settle opposite them, aware that the choices they made on this field would echo across the Balkans for generations. First light crept over the ridges east of Kosovo Polje, turning the sky from charcoal to pale gold. Frost clung to grass along the plain, catching the early glow in a delicate shimmer. For a brief moment, the land seemed untouched, as if the silence might hold back the forces poised to shatter it. But then the first horns sounded from the Allied camp, and the stillness broke. Men rose from where they had slept in their armor, stamping cold from their boots, gripping spears and reins with hands that trembled from both chill and anticipation. Across the plain, the Ottoman host stirred with equal resolve. Campfires flickered out as soldiers gathered into lines marked by banners from distant provinces. The vast formation shifted like a single organism waking from slumber. Murad's commanders moved between rows of infantry, calling orders that rippled outward in steady waves. Drums began their measured rhythm, guiding the first ranks into position beneath the rising sun. Each beat echoed across the plain, a reminder that this army had marched through half a continent to stand on this field. Lazar rode slowly along the lines of the Allied center, accompanied by officers who scanned the horizon for any early movement. The sight before them was vast. Ranks of heavy cavalry forming heart of the formation, infantry tightening shields into interlocking walls, archers adjusting positions near the rear. In the soft morning light, their armor cast muted reflections that hinted at the storm soon to come. Lazar spoke little, but those who met his gaze felt steadier for it. His presence remained a constant thread, holding the coalition together. To his left, Vlatko Vukovic marshaled the Bosnian wing. His troops arranged themselves with practiced efficiency, forming thick lines of infantry, reinforced by cavalry, prepared to strike at openings on the flank. The years spent resisting Ottoman incursions had shaped them into a unit that moved with quiet coordination. Their banners rose in slow arcs as standard-bearers found their places. The Bosnians murmured to one another, adjusting helmets and tightening straps, each man aware that the first shock of battle might fall upon them. On the opposite wing, Vuk Brankovic directed his cavalry into a broad formation. His riders, mounted on strong horses bred for endurance and impact, formed rows that stretched far across the open ground. They carried long lances and heavy shields, weapons designed for breaking enemy lines. Officers rode down the ranks, offering final reminders. Keep formation, strike as one, watch the flanks. Despite the tension between their household and Lazar's, there was no hesitation here. Every rider understood the importance of maintaining unity when the clash began. Across the field, the Ottoman deployment unfolded with disciplined precision. In the center, Janissaries gathered around Murad's pavilion, assembling in tight rows that radiated outward from the Sultan's position. Their discipline stood out even at a distance. Straight lines, synchronized movements, an unbroken rhythm of preparation. Behind them waited layers of infantry, ready to absorb the first blows. The Sultan's sons held the wings, one commanding the Anatolian contingents on the left, the other guiding Rumelian forces on the right. Cavalry units took positions along the flanks, their riders adjusting saddles and stringing bows with practiced ease. At the very front, long arcs of Ottoman archers stepped forward. They planted their stakes into the soil, creating a barrier meant to slow enemy charges. Light glinted along the tips of their arrows as they prepared for the first volley. These archers had opened countless engagements along the frontier, softening enemy lines before the main force advanced. Their presence here signaled that the battle would begin, as many others had before, but on a scale far greater than any prior encounter. The sun climbed higher, revealing the full sweep of both armies. The plain stretched between them, like a vast stage awaiting movement. Smoke from breakfast fires drifted upward, then vanished into the warming air. The wind carried the mingled scents of horses, oiled armor, and trampled grass. From the vantage point of officers standing on nearby rises, the scene resembled two immense formations, poised on opposite sides of a great threshold. Each knew that once the first order was given, the field would transform from quiet expanse to a storm of steel and dust. Lazar surveyed the Ottoman arrangement with care. His officers pointed out clusters of cavalry, likely to attempt flanking maneuvers, the dense mass of archers prepared to strike first, and the banners marking Murad's central position. They discussed where the heaviest pressure might fall, how quickly reserves should respond, and which portion of their lines needed reinforcement before the fighting began. The strategy relied on holding long enough for heavy cavalry charges on both wings to disrupt the advance. Yet no plan could erase the numerical disadvantage they faced. Vukovic's wing completed its final preparations. The Bosnians adjusted their shields into close ranks. Archers among them tested their bowstrings one last time. Horses snorted and pawed the earth as cavalry units shifted into readiness. Officers moved steadily along the lines, checking spacing and offering quiet words meant to focus rather than reassure. Their experience in earlier clashes lent them confidence, but this battle was unlike any they had faced. The sheer breadth of the Ottoman array confirmed that they stood before a force assembled for decisive victory. On the right, Brankovic gave orders to his cavalry captains. They tightened the formation into a wedge, meant to strike hard at the first moment an opening appeared. Brankovic's riders wore expressions sharpened by weeks of preparation. Each man had trained his horse for the charge, controlling pace, maintaining alignment, bracing for impact. They understood that the first moments of engagement on their wing could define the rhythm of the entire battle. Beneath their resolve lay another awareness. If their formation failed, the flank would collapse. The first volley of arrows broke the morning calm. Ottoman archers stepped forward and loosed a broad arc into the sky. The whistling sound rose like a warning before thousands of shafts fell toward the Allied front shields tilted upward, and armored riders ducked beneath their saddles as arrows rained down. Most bounced harmlessly off heavy armor, but the psychological effect was immediate. Men braced their feet, tightened their grips, and waited for the next command. Lazar's officers responded quickly. Orders passed from one end of the coalition line to the other, instructing cavalry to prepare for forward movement. Heavy riders pulled reins, lowering visors and readying lances. Infantry steadied their shields. The coalition advanced several paces, not yet a full charge, but enough to hold their ground and signal they would not be shaken by the opening strike. The motion drew a second volley, thicker than the first, arrows falling like sparks from an unseen forge. Through the haze of dust and shifting banners, Murad observed the opening movements from the center of his formation. He spoke briefly with his commanders, pointing at areas where pressure needed to increase or where reinforcements should be held back. The Sultan's calm presence at the heart of the array steadied those around him. Janissaries awaited his signal, their ranks firm as they watched the enemy formations shift into readiness. Along the Allied lines, a change in energy moved like a current. Cavalry riders leaned forward, awaiting the command that would send them thundering across the plain. Infantry braced for the surge that would follow. The dust stirred at their feet as they shifted their weight. This was the moment armies remembered for generations, the instant before the storm broke, when both sides stood balanced on the edge of history. As sunlight brightened the center of the field, the tension reached its peak. Each army had taken its place, Each commander had completed his preparations, and the ground between them seemed to hold its breath. The clash was imminent, and all eyes fixed on the center, where the first decisive movement would erupt. In the space of a heartbeat, the stillness would give way, and the battle for Kosovo Pole would begin in earnest. A tremor rolled through the Allied center as the order finally came. It passed from captain to captain, spoken low, but with unmistakable urgency. Heavy cavalry shifted forward, hooves pounding faint rhythms into the earth as riders lowered their lances. The infantry braced behind them, stepping into tighter formations, with shields raised against the lingering arrows falling from the Ottoman front. Each man felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, not as fear alone, but as clarity. What they did in the next minutes would shape everything that followed. Lazar raised his arm, signaling the first controlled advance. It was not yet the full force of the charge, but a deliberate surge meant to seize momentum. Horses responded immediately, pulling their riders toward the open ground ahead. The movement rippled outward until the entire Allied front pressed forward. Several strides, dust rose beneath the pounding hooves, curling upward into the sunlight. The sound was enough to draw a change in the Ottoman formation, as their archers stepped back behind the stakes they had driven into the soil. On the Allied left, Vukovic watched for openings. His infantry began their measured push, stepping forward in coordinated ranks. Shields brushed together with a steady scrape, creating a rolling sound that carried across the plain. Behind them, cavalry prepared to accelerate the moment his signal came. Vukovic studied the Ottoman wing before him, units drawn from Balkan vassals mixed with Anatolian detachments, and judged their spacing. A decisive strike here could break their alignment, but only if timed with precision. Brankovic's cavalry on the right also advanced, their wedge formation holding tight. The riders leaned forward in near unison, creating a dark line of steel and horses moving with rising intensity. Officers rode along the flanks, calling reminders to maintain formation, to watch the ground ahead, to wait for the final signal before unleashing their full power. Every man prepared himself for the shock of impact when metal met wood and flesh on the other side. From the Ottoman center, Murad observed the advancing coalition calmly. He gestured toward his archers, and a third volley arced into the sky. This one fell deeper into the coalition ranks, but again, the heavy armor of the Allied riders absorbed most of the attack. The Sultan's infantry shifted forward in layered lines, forming a steady wall behind which reserves waited with disciplined patience. Murad's sons on the wings began repositioning their cavalry, spreading them wider to prevent a sudden breakthrough. The entire field seemed to tighten under their adjustments. Then the coalition's command rose above the din. A sharp cry carried across lines. The Allied cavalry surged. The movement began as a controlled gallop. Lances angled forward, armor ringing as riders urged their mounts into acceleration. Moments later, the advance became a thunderous charge. Dust erupted behind them in swirling clouds. The combined weight of hundreds of armored riders bore down on the Ottoman center and its supporting wings. The ground beneath them shook. Men along both sides clenched weapons tighter. The first impact struck the Ottoman center. Serbian heavy cavalry smashed into the front line, crushing stakes and scattering archers forced to fall back. The shock of the collision sent ripples through the Janissary ranks behind them. Yet these elite troops responded with practiced formation changes, bracing with shields and drawing blades to meet the cavalry pushing against their line. The sound was a deafening clash, iron ringing against shields, shouts from both sides mixing with the cries of wounded horses. To the left, Vukovic's wing gained the early advantage. His infantry pressed forward with surprising momentum, forcing back vassal troops unprepared for the weight of their advance. When a gap opened near the flank, his cavalry pushed through with powerful strikes, scattering lighter units that attempted to regroup behind their commanders. Vukovic's riders swept deeper toward the Ottoman rear, leaving disarray in their wake. Cheers rose briefly from the Allied lines as messengers carried news of the success along the left flank. On the right, Brankovic's riders collided with equal force. Their charge drove deep into the Ottoman formations, forcing Anatolian infantry to buckle under pressure. Shields shattered, lines bent, and for a moment the coalition seemed poised to drive the entire flank backward. Dust engulfed the riders, obscuring much of the chaos beneath it. From glimpses through the haze, officers could see Ottoman troops retreating in uneven steps. The momentum here threatened to break their entire position. Yet the Ottoman response came swiftly. Murad's sons directed reinforcements toward both wings, signaling cavalry units to countercharge. Drums from the Ottoman rear pounded out new rhythms, coordinating movement across the vast formation. Light cavalry swept forward, unleashing arrows into the exposed flanks of the Allied wings. At the same time, infantry reserves surged toward the pressure points, stabilizing lines before they could collapse entirely. Dust and noise filled the air as the Ottoman host reshaped itself to absorb the initial blow. At the center of the field, Lazar's advance met fierce resistance. Janissaries, recovering from the first shock, began pushing back against the heavy cavalry pressing into their ranks. Their spears angled upward into charging horses, halting riders in sudden, brutal collisions. The coalition's infantry moved forward to reinforce the struggling cavalry, creating a chaotic tangle of shields and blades. Officers shouted to maintain cohesion, while fresh waves of Ottoman troops stepped into the fray. Despite the violence of these first moments, the battle had not yet tipped toward either side. Both armies held their ground with determination, born from months of preparation. Successes on the Allied wings gave hope, but the center's struggle kept the outcome uncertain. Murad's commanders responded to every shift with disciplined precision, reinforcing weak points and pushing back where the coalition gained ground. The coalition, for its part, refused to yield, pressing forward wherever resistance softened. As the sun climbed higher, its light began to spread across the full breadth of Kosovo-Polje. The dew that had glistened at dawn vanished under trampling feet and rising heat. Dust hung steadily above the battlefield, blurring the forms of men and horses locked in combat. Shouts, commands, and the clang of weapons turned the quiet plain into a storm of sound. By mid-morning, the first stage of the battle had revealed the strength of both sides. Neither had broken. Both wings had tasted success. The center remained a brutal contest of endurance. Yet beneath the struggle ran an unspoken truth felt by every commander. This was only the beginning. The decisive moments had yet to come, and the outcome would depend on who could hold their ground when the battle exacted its full price. Across the Allied line, a sense of grim resolve settled over the soldiers. They had endured the opening volleys, survived the first collisions, and held their positions against forces that outnumbered them, but they also saw the depth of the host arrayed against them. As dust rose in thicker clouds and reinforcements gathered in the Ottoman rear, all understood that the fiercest moments of the battle were still approaching. Kosovo-Polje had awakened fully now. The dawn's stillness was gone. In its place stood a battlefield, poised to devour everything both armies had brought to this field. Heat settled over Kosovo-Polje as the morning advanced, turning the dust kicked up by thousands of men into a pale haze that hovered just above the ground. What had begun at dawn as a decisive surge by the Allied cavalry now stretched into a battle defined by endurance. Every fighter on the plain felt the shift. The exhilaration of the first charge had faded, replaced by the heavy strain of holding formation under relentless pressure. The clash had entered its most volatile phase, one in which resolve mattered as much as strength. At the center, the struggle grew harsher with every passing moment. Lazar's armored riders had broken into the outer ranks of the Janissaries, their momentum scattering archers and collapsing the first line of defense, but the disciplined infantry behind them stood resolute, adjusting their shields and angling their weapons to meet the surge. Horses slammed into their formation, driving men backward in jolting waves, yet the Janissaries held on, absorbing the shock with practiced precision. The air rang with the clang of iron, the crack of splintered lances, and the guttural cries of men pushing their bodies to the limit. Lazar remained near the thickest pressure, guiding movements where the line bent under strain. His presence steadied those around him. Captains moved with urgency, calling for additional infantry to reinforce sections of the line that showed signs of giving way. These foot soldiers entered the fray without hesitation, lifting shields over their heads to ward off arrows as they advanced. Once among the cavalry, they anchored positions that threatened to collapse, creating a synergy that momentarily renewed the center's strength. Still, the Ottoman host showed no sign of fracturing. Reinforcements flowed into the contested areas with seamless coordination. Infantry reserves stepped forward to close gaps left by fallen fighters, while cavalry units skirted the edges of the melee, searching for openings to exploit. It became clear to the Allied commanders that their early advantage was slipping. The longer the battle endured, the more the Ottoman depth of manpower asserted itself. On the Allied left, Vukovic continued to press aggressively. His initial push had driven back Ottoman vassal troops, forcing them to regroup under constant harassment, but the surge could not last without interruption. Ottoman cavalry arrived in sweeping formations that darted along the flank. Arrows hissed through the air, arcing downward into the Bosnian ranks. Shields clattered as riders dipped behind them, adjusting positions while attempting to maintain cohesion. Vukovic recognized the pattern immediately. This was not chaotic resistance, but deliberate tactical pressure, designed to reclaim the ground they had lost. The danger intensified when the Ottoman cavalry began feigning retreat. It was a maneuver practiced across decades of frontier warfare, one that lured overeager opponents into overextending themselves. Several of Vukovic's riders, fueled by the fervor of earlier success, surged forward in pursuit. The moment they crossed too far ahead, Ottoman riders wheeled around and struck with fierce precision. Arrows rained from unexpected angles, forcing the Bosnian companies into a chaotic retreat back toward their original position. Officers shouted for discipline, struggling to draw the factions back into formation before the Ottoman infantry pressed further into the gap. On the right, Brankovic faced similar challenges. His wedge-shaped cavalry formation had inflicted significant damage on the Anatolian wing riders had broken through the first ranks, turning what might have been a contained engagement into a full confrontation. Across uneven ground, dust rose in thick spirals as horses reared and infantry scattered. Yet what seemed like a breakthrough soon became a congested struggle. Ottoman reinforcements arrived steadily, filling the spaces Brankovic's cavalry had carved open moments earlier. Each fresh unit entering the flank restored strength where collapse had seemed imminent. Brankovic pushed forward once more, urging his riders to strike at the gathering mass before it could organize. The response came quickly. Ottoman cavalry countercharged with remarkable speed. The collision was devastating. Shields splintering, weapons clashing, horses stumbling from the sheer force. The momentum Brankovic had built evaporated under the weight of fresh opposition. Even seasoned commanders among his ranks found themselves fighting, just to maintain their footing in a storm growing more intense by the second. As pressure mounted on both wings, communication between the Allied sections grew increasingly difficult. Dust choked the air, obscuring signals. Horns struggled to cut through the noise. Messengers carrying orders across the battlefield found themselves delayed or forced to take alternate routes to avoid pockets of still unfolding combat. This fragmentation weakened the unity that had carried the coalition through the first stages of the battle. Units that once acted in coordinated rhythm now responded to the crises immediately before them. At the center, exhaustion became evident. The heavy cavalry that had driven so forcefully into the Janissary ranks now fought in dense clusters, the initial cohesion lost amid the chaos. Horses heaved in the heat. Armor weighed heavily on the riders' shoulders. Even so, the coalition's determination remained unbroken. Lazar continued to move through the thickest fighting, shouting orders and urging officers to reinforce the lines. The sight of his banner lifted spirits even among those who had begun to falter. Men who moments earlier had retreated a step now pressed forward again. Yet the Ottoman reserves were far from depleted. More infantry emerged from the rear formations, joining ranks with those already engaged. Their steady influx allowed the Janissaries to regain lost ground and push back against the Allied center. Blades met shields in rapid exchanges. The sounds of combat rose into a storm of clattering metal and shouted commands. Slowly, the coalition's advance ground to a halt. The once forward surge shifted into a desperate effort simply to hold position. This was the moment described differently by every source that survived the battle. Amid the dust and uproar, a figure from the Allied lines is said to have broken toward the Ottoman center. Some accounts describe a knight accompanied by a group of companions who cut through the melee with astonishing resolve. Others claim a lone warrior moved unseen through pockets of disordered soldiers until reaching Murad's position. A few versions suggest deception rather than force, that the figure approached as if surrendering or delivering a message. There were even whispers of a man rising from among the fallen, seizing a fleeting opportunity. The truth of this moment remains uncertain. All that can be confirmed is what followed. Murad fell. Word traveled quickly among those closest to the center. The Ottoman formation wavered, but only for a breath. Bayezid, positioned on one of the wings, reacted immediately. His commanders snapped into motion with well-practiced clarity. Orders spread across the formation, instructing units to tighten ranks and push forward with renewed force. The hesitation that might have shattered the Ottoman line dissolved before most fighters even realized what had happened. With Bayezid assuming control, the Ottomans launched a coordinated counterattack. Infantry surged toward the center. Cavalry struck the flanks where they sensed weakness. Archers moved to positions where their volleys could fall into densely packed Allied ranks. It was an overwhelming surge, one designed to break the coalition before they could capitalize on the chaos of Murad's death. The Allied wings felt the shift immediately. On the left, Vukovic's men, already strained, began to fall back under concentrated pressure. Ottoman forces pressed deep into the gaps forming between companies. Vukovic tried to stabilize the retreat, but the intensity of the assault forced him to pull his men further toward the center to avoid encirclement. On the right, Brankovic's riders met a similar fate. Their horses, exhausted from earlier charges, struggled to push through the reinforced enemy line. Ottoman cavalry executed wide sweeps, forcing Brankovich's men to withdraw to avoid being trapped. The retreat was measured, but it signaled a decisive change in momentum. As both wings bent inward, the Allied center became exposed to attacks from multiple directions. Lazar's infantry braced themselves, locking shields in an unbroken wall. But the pressure was immense. Ottoman troops converged on the coalition's heart, tightening the circle with every step forward. Dust and heat obscured everything beyond arm's reach. Officers struggled to keep their companies together. The battlefield's earlier clarity had dissolved entirely into a storm of shifting shapes and shadows. By the time midday approached, the battle had reached a critical threshold. Success, fatigue, courage, and desperation all collided in a single moment, suspended between victory and collapse. The decision would come in the hours still ahead, but already the outcome hinged on the coalition's ability to endure a storm that refused to break, one commanded now by a leader determined to avenge the fall of his father. The turning points had begun. The struggle for control of the battlefield had entered its most dangerous phase, and the fate of the Balkans trembled at the balance point between two forces unwilling to yield. Heat thickened over Kosovo-Polje as the battle pushed into its most punishing hours. The clash that had begun with thunderous charges now resembled a vast, grinding storm. Spreading across the plain, dust clung to sweat-soaked armor. Horses heaved beneath exhausted riders, and the cries of the wounded carried through the shifting haze. What had been moments of clear direction earlier had dissolved into a struggle fought at arm's length, where every heartbeat felt like it could determine the fate of the field. At the center, Lazar's troops endured the relentless pressure of the Ottoman infantry. Janissaries pressed forward with unwavering discipline, stepping over fallen comrades, driving their shields ahead as they forced back the Allied cavalry. The shock of each collision rattled through the ranks. Riders who had burst forward during the early charge now found themselves trapped in pockets of close combat, where their mounts offered little advantage. Infantry stepped in around them, forming tight clusters to resist the tightening pressure. Lazar remained visible in the midst of this chaos, urging his men with gestures more than words. Dust made shouting almost futile, but his presence carried through the turbulence. Every time his banner appeared above the melee, fighters regained their footing and pushed back with renewed effort. Officers worked tirelessly to maintain coherence among the fractured companies. They redirected infantry, reinforced wavering sections, and formed small defensive enclaves around isolated cavalry units. Even with this determination, the strain became unmistakable. The initial momentum that had driven the coalition deep into the Ottoman center now faded beneath the weight of enemy reinforcements. Each time Allied forces gained a few paces, fresh Ottoman infantry filled the gaps, bracing to halt the advance. The plain beneath them turned uneven from the churned soil and bodies that began to carpet the center, making movement more difficult with each passing minute. On the left, Vukovic's efforts to stabilize his wing unfolded against similarly punishing conditions. The Ottoman counterattack had disrupted the formation just as it was preparing to reassert control. Now, Vukovic moved constantly among his men, calling for shields to tighten and archers to adjust their positions to compensate for the relentless pressure. His cavalry, which had once threatened to break the enemy's flank entirely, shifted into a defensive posture. They circled in measured arcs to prevent Ottoman riders from sweeping behind them, a constant balancing act between forward motion and survival. Vukovic's infantry endured volleys of arrows that descended in waves. Shields raised overhead provided some protection, but not enough to prevent casualties. Gaps formed where men fell, forcing officers to move quickly to close the lines. Every adjustment cost precious time and energy, and the wing's ability to hold its position began to fray. Yet even through this strain, the Bosnian fighters refused to break. They dug into the soil with the grit of men who knew they were fighting not only for their lives, but for the lands behind them. On the right, Brankovic's situation had become equally precarious. The forward push that once carried hope of collapsing the Ottoman flank had slowed to a halt. Riders found themselves in tight quarters, struggling to maneuver as enemy formations pressed inward. Brankovic's captains shouted for tighter grouping, knowing that any misalignment could open a path for Ottoman cavalry to slip through their horses. Lathered with sweat, struggled to adjust footing on ground, made treacherous by the endless churn of hooves. When Ottoman reinforcements struck again, the impact sent shockwaves through the already strained formation. Riders who had fought since morning now braced against opponents who appeared fresher and more coordinated. Arrows fell among them without respite, and each passing moment forced Brankovic to reconsider his options. To remain in place meant risking encirclement. To pull back meant surrendering ground that earlier charges had fought so hard to gain. He chose survival. His call for a measured withdrawal passed quickly down the line. The retreat was disciplined, but heavy with the weight of disappointment. Riders pulled away in staggered groups, shielding one another as they moved back toward their own infantry. This maneuver prevented immediate collapse, but it also signaled that the wing no longer had strength to press forward. Men who had begun the day with fierce momentum now struggled simply to hold a functional line. With both wings strained and the center fighting for every inch of ground, Bayezid intensified the Ottoman assault. His understanding of the battle's shifting rhythm allowed him to coordinate a pressure that came from multiple directions. At once, Ottoman infantry pressed the Allied center, while cavalry stretched the wings, forcing them into tightening arcs that bent toward the middle. Light troops darted in and out of the fray, harassing exposed positions with arrows and spears. The effect was suffocating. Amid this turbulence, the stories surrounding Murad's fall continued circulating in fragments across the battlefield. Some whispered that the Sultan had died in the heart of the melee. Others claimed he had been struck near his command post after an unexpected breach. These rumors reached portions of the Ottoman lines, but Bayezid's swift response ensured that panic never took root. His officers urged their men onward, reinforcing that victory depended on maintaining pressure, not faltering beneath the weight of uncertainty. For the Allied forces, however, the rumor carried a different tone. Soldiers who heard whispers of Murad's fall felt a brief surge of hope. They pushed harder, swinging weapons with renewed force, believing that if the enemy faltered even slightly, they could pivot the battle's direction. Yet every surge met the same obstacle: fresh Ottoman troops closing the gaps faster than the Allies could create them. Hope alone could not overcome exhaustion. In the center, Lazar watched as his men strained to maintain the line. The shield wall behind the cavalry bent under the weight of repeated assaults from infantry pressing in from both flanks. He signaled officers to reposition units where the pressure threatened to break through. They moved as quickly as the crowded battlefield allowed, carrying out orders even as danger closed around them. The center held, but barely. On the left, Vukovic's retreat grew more pronounced. His infantry, battered by constant volleys, stepped backward in staggered movements. Cavalry moved behind them, forming a screen to prevent the Ottoman riders from driving too deeply into the gaps. The wing managed to avoid collapse, but only at the cost of sacrificing ground. Each step backward brought the Ottomans closer to the heart of the Allied formation. On the right, Brankovic's withdrawal continued. His riders regrouped around a cluster of infantry that had moved forward to anchor the retreat. Officers worked tirelessly to keep men aligned, but exhaustion and the chaotic visibility made precise coordination nearly impossible. The wing did not rout, but its power was spent. Its earlier strength had been replaced by sheer determination to prevent a decisive breach. Through all of this, Lazar fought to maintain the center's cohesion. The narrowing formation meant that the Allied infantry and cavalry now stood within closer proximity, packed together in a shrinking space that offered diminishing room to maneuver. Ottoman pressure from both wings threatened to envelop them. Dust choked the air until visibility shrank to a few paces. Men swung at shapes rather than clear targets. Shields cracked. Horses collapsed. The center groaned under the continuous weight of the Ottoman surge. By early afternoon, the battlefield had transformed into a crucible where every decision carried disproportionate consequence. Both sides had inflicted heavy casualties. Both had endured moments where collapse seemed imminent. Yet the advantage shifted now toward the host capable of sustaining pressure. Indefinitely, Bayezid controlled a force with depth. Fresh troops still arriving from the rear, cavalry units ready to strike at any exposed angle, and infantry that advanced with relentless precision. The Allied coalition, held together by courage and necessity, began to feel the strain of overwhelming numbers. Their early promise had been fierce, but the cost of maintaining momentum had drained their reserves. As pressure converged on the shrinking center, the plain itself seemed to close in around them. The pivotal moments had passed. The scales were tilting, and across Kosovo-Poljem, every fighter sensed that the final phase of the battle was approaching, one that would decide not only the fate of the men still standing, but the destiny of the lands behind them. Afternoon light dimmed behind drifting veils of dust as the battle reached its breaking point. What had begun as ordered lines and coordinated maneuvers now resembled a vast, heaving landscape of bodies locked in combat, stretching from one end of Kosovo-Polje to the other. The plain had become a labyrinth of shattered shields, collapsed horses, and men fighting in desperate clusters. Every step forward or backward was contested. Every breath tasted of earth and iron. For those still standing in the Allied center, the weight of exhaustion hung like a shroud. Lazar's troops held their positions with a determination born of necessity, but the pressure around them grew heavier each moment. The narrowing formation trapped the coalition in a tightening arc, forcing infantry and cavalry into crowded pockets where movement became difficult. Ottoman units advanced with steady rhythm, their lines reinforced as soon as losses appeared. Bayezid's officers carried out his orders with disciplined precision, drawing their forces inward in a strategy designed to crush the remaining defenders from multiple sides. The Allied center felt the strain as the wings began to fold back toward them. From the left, Vukovic's battered troops took their places within the shrinking perimeter. Dust streaked their faces, and their shields bore deep cuts from the earlier clashes. They had held far longer than many expected, but their retreat had cost them dearly. Men stumbled into the center with torn armor, some limping, others bleeding from wounds they had no time to tend. Officers shouted for them to fill gaps in the line as Ottoman infantry pressed closer. From the right, Brankovic's riders moved with equal urgency. Their horses were spent, flanks lathered, heads hanging low from exhaustion. What had been a proud cavalry wedge had become a cluster of warriors fighting to stay alive. Brankovic himself rode near the rear, guiding the remnants toward Lazar's position. He saw the tightening formation and understood the danger instantly. If the center collapsed, there would be no route of escape, not for him, not for any of them. As both wings bent inward, the coalition's formation began to resemble a crescent, its its horns drawn toward the middle by relentless force. Ottoman cavalry swept the edges, searching for weak points. Infantry advanced in compact lines, shields raised to deflect arrows from the remaining Allied archers. The shrinking perimeter forced the defenders into a tighter circle, creating moments when men found themselves crushed against one another, unable to lift weapons fully or turn shields to meet incoming blows. Lazar moved along the front with his banner held high. The men who saw him felt a brief resurgence of resolve. Officers rallied to him, drawing strength from the sight of their leader still directing the fight, despite the chaos closing around them. At one point, he dismounted to help steady a shield wall that had bent under the force of a charge. His commanders urged him to reposition for safety, but he continued walking the line, calling for discipline and unity even as dust and blood masked his face. In the thick of this struggle, desperation began to shape decisions on both sides. Small groups of Allied cavalry attempted short charges to create breathing room, but each push met an equal surge of Ottoman infantry. The ground beneath them was too churned and crowded for sustained movement, and the riders were forced back into the defensive circle before gaining meaningful ground. Infantry fought in tight knots, bracing shields against the endless pressure. Arrows fell sporadically, fired by archers who found narrow gaps between advancing units, yet the effect barely slowed the tide. The Ottoman advance intensified when Bayezid directed fresh troops toward the weakened left. These reinforcements had waited in reserve for hours, conserving their strength. Now they moved forward with steady determination. Their arrival struck Vukovic's already fatigued men with overwhelming force. Shields splintered under the impact, lines twisted, and many were driven backward into the coalition's core. The sudden collapse forced nearby companies to turn and brace themselves, exposing other angles to enemy strikes. Meanwhile, the right wing's collapse accelerated. Brankovic's retreat had been measured, but the lack of space now turned that caution into vulnerability. Ottoman cavalry darted behind isolated groups, cutting down riders whose horses stumbled on the trampled ground. Officers shouted commands, but the dust and noise swallowed most of their words. Even so, Brankovic's men refused to rout. They fought in dense clusters, each step backward taken with deliberation. Their survival depended on maintaining cohesion for as long as possible. Within the center, the weight of the encirclement became undeniable. The coalition's infantry planted their feet and lifted their shields in a solid wall, yet the pressure from all sides wore them down. Spears thrust from the gaps between shields, clashing with the weapons of an enemy that never seemed to thin. Every soldier understood that their next breath might be their last. Still they fought, refusing to yield ground. Somewhere within this tightening ring, the moment came when Lazar found himself separated from portions of his retinue. A sudden surge from the Ottoman side forced his guards into a frantic effort to close ranks around him. Shouts rose from both armies as fighters recognized his banner, flickering amid the dust. The pressure on the center increased further, driven by a wave of enemy infantry intent on cutting through whatever shield wall remained. Lazar continued to urge his men forward, but the chaos eroded the clarity of his command. The coalition's ranks had thinned drastically. Many riders had lost their mounts. Infantry stood shoulder to shoulder, with cavalry fighting on foot. Officers tried to regroup companies that had been scattered by the earlier crush, but the distances between clusters grew too large to bridge under the constant assault. The Ottoman host saw its opening. Bayezid ordered a coordinated push aimed directly at the heart of the coalition. Janissaries pressed forward in tight formation, driving wedges into the lines until they split. Cavalry swept along the edges of the fractures. widening them and cutting off isolated groups of defenders. The plain, once filled with structured formations, dissolved into pockets of resistance fighting amid the rising dust. Vukovic's last stand unfolded near the left flank. His men formed a stubborn knot of resistance, their shields braced against waves of infantry. Yet the pressure became unbearable. Surrounded on all sides, they fought until their lines collapsed under the weight of superior numbers. A handful managed to break away, but most fell on the field they had defended since morning. On the right, Brankovic recognized the battle's collapse. He signaled for his remaining cavalry to withdraw, while some semblance of escape was still possible. The decision saved a portion of his forces, but many others were swallowed by the melee before they could pull free. Their retreat, though controlled, left the center exposed to even greater danger. In the heart of the battlefield, Lazar's final moments approached. His banner flickered behind the shifting dust clouds as Ottoman troops closed around him. Accounts later differed on whether he fell while fighting or was taken alive amid the struggle. What became clear was that the collapse of the center sealed his fate. Surrounded and isolated, he was overwhelmed in the final crush of the encirclement. Once the coalition's core dissolved, the battle shifted swiftly. The remnants of the Allied force attempted to flee, but the Ottomans pressed their advantage with relentless fervor. Those who managed to break free fled toward the surrounding hills. Others were overtaken in the final pursuit. The plain, so vibrant with the clash of armies at dawn, now lay covered in bodies, Ottoman and Allied alike, marking the terrible cost of the day. By late afternoon, the battlefield grew quiet except for the shouts of Ottoman soldiers securing their positions and searching for survivors. The victory had come at immense cost. The fields of Kosovo Polje, once a broad stretch of open land, were now scarred with deep trenches carved by hooves, littered weapons, and the fallen from both armies. The battle had ended, but its echoes would continue through a region forever altered by what had unfolded beneath the midsummer sun. Shadows lengthened across Kosovo Polje as the final phase of the battle unfolded. Heat that once shimmered over the plain now settled into a heavy stillness, broken only by the sounds of pursuit and the ragged breath of fighters who had survived the worst of the encirclement. Dust clouds still hung in the air, drifting slowly through the fading light. Moments earlier, the field had been alive with motion. Now it felt like a vast, exhausted expanse where only the last acts of the confrontation remained. Ottoman commanders directed their troops with sharp gestures, urging them to secure the areas where resistance lingered. The encirclement around the Allied center had shattered into scattered pockets. Each group of survivors fought with the desperation of men who understood the fate that awaited them if they fell. Some formed tight circles, lifting shields to create brief sanctuaries against the tide closing around them. Others attempted to push toward the edges of the field, hoping to break free and retreat into the hills beyond. The Ottoman cavalry, still formidable despite the long day, swept along these routes, cutting off escape whenever possible. Near the eastern edge of the field, one such pocket remained stubbornly intact. Men from Lazar's personal household gathered around their lord, trying to shield him as they made their way through the shifting remnants of the Allied formation. The chaos made direction nearly impossible. Dust obscured the horizon, turning every movement into a silhouette. Shouts of officers and the clash of steel resonated from all directions, offering no indication of where safety might lie. The men around Lazar fought toward any gap that opened, only to have it close moments later beneath the weight of reinforcing enemy units. Lazar himself continued to resist, surrounded by guards who refused to abandon their duty, even as exhaustion bore down on them. The group managed to carve a narrow path before being driven back by waves of infantry. What had once been a coordinated withdrawal turned into a fight for mere survival. Accounts of these moments varied, yet all agreed that Lazar remained at the center of his men's efforts, a rallying point until the very end. As Ottoman units pressed inward, the last line of defenders around him collapsed. Some fell where they stood. Others were forced away by the crush of men converging on the center. In the confusion, Lazar was seized by advancing infantry. Those who witnessed the scene described him still gripping his weapon, surrounded by soldiers who recognized the significance of capturing him alive. Word of his detainment traveled swiftly across the tightening circle. Officers hurried forward to secure the area, ensuring the prisoner could be taken before the remnants of the retreating allies attempted a final rescue. Elsewhere on the plain, Vukovic's remaining fighters continued resisting long after their position had been overrun. The Bosnian commander led the survivors of his shattered wing northward, shielding the retreat of those still able to move. Their formation, reduced to a fraction of its earlier strength, fought in staggered movements toward the ridges beyond the field. Ottoman cavalry pursued them through pockets of thick dust, but Vukovic's men used the terrain to their advantage, slipping behind small rises or doubling back through the densest fighting. By the time the sun fell lower on the horizon, he had guided enough of his troops to safety to preserve the remnants of his contingent. Brankovic's retreat followed a different path. His cavalry, though battered, managed to keep formation long enough to break away. Before the encirclement closed fully around the center, riding westward along the plain, they skirted the edges of the Ottoman chase. Dust-covered and weary, they still managed a controlled withdrawal, relying on the speed of their remaining mounts to outpace the cavalry sent to intercept them. By nightfall, Brankovic had led a significant portion of his forces out of immediate danger. Their escape would shape the struggles that followed. But for now, survival was the only measure of success. Meanwhile, the coalition's infantry scattered in every direction. Some fled toward nearby woods, hoping to regroup once the pursuit slackened. Others hid among the dead, until darkness offered a chance to slip away unnoticed. A few remained on the field, tending to wounded comrades who could not be moved. Their loyalty held even as enemy lines tightened around them. The Ottoman soldiers moved steadily across the plain, disarming survivors and taking prisoners where resistance had ceased. It was during these final sweeps that Bayezid received word of Lazar's capture. He moved toward the center of the field, surrounded by his officers. When he arrived, he found the Serbian lord brought before him, visibly fatigued from the ordeal. Dust clung to their faces, and the contrast between their exhausted expressions and the triumphant atmosphere around them created a scene that would linger in memory long after the battle ended. What happened next was swift. The execution was carried out under Bayezid's authority, marking the end of the coalition's leadership. For the men still fleeing across Kosovo-Polje, the sight of their fallen leader, passed from one retelling to another, would become the defining memory of the day. Among those who later returned to search for survivors or retrieve the fallen, this moment became inseparable from the story of the battle itself. The battlefield quieted as night descended. Torches flickered across the plain, carried by soldiers searching for injured comrades or gathering abandoned weapons. The cries of the wounded echoed faintly through the drifting dust. Horses moved uneasily among the debris, stepping around the bodies that covered the field. Everywhere, the signs of the day's violence remained visible: shattered shields, broken spears, and footprints etched into the soil by the endless motion of battle. Ottoman officers supervised the organization of the field. Messengers moved between companies, carrying reports of casualties and movements beyond the immediate area. Patrols extended outward to ensure that no pockets of resistance lingered in the surrounding hills. The victory had cost them dearly. Even among those who celebrated, the toll was evident in the number of fallen soldiers who lay scattered among the remnants of the Allied host. For the survivors of the coalition, the aftermath carried a different weight. Small groups gathered under cover of darkness, tending to the wounded with whatever supplies remained. Whispered conversations drifted through the night. Accounts of the final moments, questions about who had escaped, and predictions of what would follow. Now that both armies had lost their leaders, some spoke of retreating north to join remaining strongholds. Others chose to remain hidden until the dawn revealed a clearer path. As the night deepened, Kosovo Polje lay still, marked by the memory of a battle neither side could regard without grief. The ground that had seen so much movement during the day now held a somber quiet. The fallen, whether Serbian, Bosnian, Albanian, Anatolian or Rumelian, lay beneath the same fading light. The immediate struggle had ended, but its consequences had only begun to shape the lands beyond the plain. By the time the first stars appeared, both armies had departed in different directions, one to secure its newfound position, the other to salvage what remained. The field, stripped of motion, carried the echo of a day that would be remembered not only for its scale and ferocity, but for the profound shift it unleashed across the Balkans. The battle had ended, yet its shadow stretched far beyond the borders of Kosovo, touching lives and territories that had not yet realized how deeply this day would define their future. The morning after, the battle rose slowly over Kosovo Polje, as if hesitant to reveal the devastation left behind. Mist pooled in low patches across the plain, drifting between fallen banners and the bodies of men and horses that lay thick upon the trampled earth. The silence that settled over the field felt unreal compared to the thunder of the previous day. Only distant hoofbeats broke the stillness. Ottoman patrols riding cautious circuits, ensuring that no pockets of resistance remained. The battle was over, but the struggle for what came next had already begun. Bayezid had withdrawn from the field long before dawn. His officers moved quickly through the remnants of the encampment, gathering reports and directing their units northward. The urgency of their departure hinted at more than victory. It spoke to Bayezid's awareness that the death of his father demanded immediate action. News of Murad's fall during the battle would spread rapidly, and any delay risked giving rivals time to challenge the succession. Though his triumph at Kosovo granted him legitimacy in the eyes of his commanders, the empire was vast, with distant provinces that might question a transition of power unless confirmed swiftly and decisively. Far from the battlefield, word of the clash traveled unevenly. Couriers galloped along mountain passes toward Bulgaria, Wallachia, and the Adriatic hinterlands. Each rider carried versions of the events shaped by those who had survived. Among the Balkan courts, uncertainty grew. Some lords heard rumors of Murad's death and assumed the Ottoman advance had been halted entirely. Others received conflicting messages claiming that the coalition had fought valiantly but failed to hold the plain. In towns where few details were known, speculation replaced fact. The battle had been so fierce, so costly, that neither victory nor defeat appeared clear at first glance. Within the Serbian heartland, the aftermath unfolded with somber precision. Lazar's widow, Melissa, faced the burden of leadership at a moment when the realm felt hollowed by loss. Her son, still young, lacked the authority to command the fractured remnants of the nobility. Messages reached her court throughout the day, some confirming her husband's fall, others reporting the survival of Branković's and Vukovic's remaining forces. These fragments painted a picture of devastation, but also of possibility. What remained of Serbia could still endure, but only through careful decisions and an acceptance of the harsh realities emerging from the south. Delegations from surrounding lords arrived in hurried succession. Each sought clarity, what remained of Serbia's strength, who commanded what territories, and how the region might shield itself from further Ottoman pressure. Some nobles, weakened by the loss of their men, offered support to militia, hoping unity might protect them. Others withdrew to their estates, reinforcing their walls and preparing for the political turbulence that would follow. The alliances Lazar had forged before the battle fractured into wary cooperation at best. The shared purpose that brought them together on Kosovo Polje dissolved in the face of survival. Across the Ottoman realm, Bayezid's ascent continued with rapid momentum. He reached Edirne ahead of most reports, presenting himself as the rightful successor before rivals could gather strength. His officers confirmed his command, and messengers sent word to distant garrisons that Murad had fallen, but the empire remained secure. The swift consolidation of power forced uncertain provinces into acceptance. Governors who might have hesitated found themselves bound by the news of victory at Kosovo and the presence of a new sultan already issuing orders. For vassal rulers in the Balkans, the implications became clear quickly. Those who had long maintained uneasy peace with the Ottomans now faced an even more assertive leader. Some sent immediate messages reaffirming loyalty. Others tried to negotiate terms, hoping to capitalize on Bayezid's need to stabilize the region. Their decisions reflected a landscape in which resistance had been broken, but autonomy was still negotiable, if only temporarily. Meanwhile, Brankovic and the remnants of his cavalry reached their fortified estates. Their escape from the battle preserved a core of military strength, yet his survival carried mixed consequences. Some saw him as the lord who could withstand further Ottoman advances through careful maneuvering. Others whispered doubts, questioning his decisions during the battle and the price of saving his own men while the coalition collapsed. Regardless of interpretation, his position became central to the political struggles that followed. Bosnia, too, felt the weight of aftermath. Vukovic's return brought both relief and uncertainty. His contingent had suffered enormous losses, though many had survived through disciplined retreat. Messages sent to King Tvutko described the battle in stark terms. The bravery of Allied forces, the ferocity of the Ottoman host, and the enormous cost paid by all who stood on the field. Tvutko's court leaned heavily on these accounts to craft a narrative of participation that emphasized honor rather than defeat. Even so, Bosnia recognized that the Ottomans, though grievously wounded, had emerged the dominant military power in the region. While political centers grappled with these shifting realities, small groups of survivors wandered the edges of Kosovo Polje. Some returned to the field in search of fallen relatives or commanders. Others sought confirmation of rumors circulating in villages, stories of Lazar's capture, of Murad's death, of Brankovic's retreat. These men carried first-hand accounts to towns and monasteries, shaping the earliest retellings of the battle. Their memories mixed with fear, pride, confusion, and grief, creating an uneven narrative that would change each time it crossed another border. The battlefield itself began to transition from place of combat to place of reckoning. Shepherds from nearby hamlets approached hesitantly, helping to bury the dead where possible, or guiding Ottoman patrols to bodies that needed to be identified. Priests walked through the rows of fallen men, offering prayers, sometimes recognizing familiar faces among those who had fought under their local lords. Horses wandered aimlessly, lost among the carnage. The plain bore scars from trenches carved by cavalry wheels, collapsed tents, and patches of earth darkened by blood. As days passed, Bayezid's authority gradually extended across the territories weakened by the battle. Some towns sent representatives asking for guarantees of safety. Others submitted without negotiation, their leaders recognizing that the alternative would bring destruction. The Ottoman administration began integrating these lands into its growing system through new taxes, garrison placements, and political agreements binding local nobles to Bayezid's expanding authority. For Serbia, the next steps demanded difficult choices. Melissa faced pressure from multiple sides, Ottoman envoys seeking submission, Hungarian forces probing from the north, and nobles within her realm weighing whether to support her or act independently. Messages arrived from monasteries urging unity in the face of catastrophe. Monks recorded the events with solemn care, noting not only the losses, but the profound impact the battle had on every corner of their society. Through this uncertainty, one truth emerged with increasing clarity. The balance of power in the Balkans had shifted irreversibly. The victory at Kosovo, though costly, gave Bayezid the momentum needed to expand his influence deeper into the region. At the same time, the losses suffered by the coalition fractured the political landscape, leaving lords to navigate a world suddenly transformed. Yet even amid the upheaval, the story of the battle took root in ways that extended beyond politics. Those who survived carried with them the memory of the field at dawn, the thunder of the first charge, the tightening circle of the final hours. Songs, laments, and whispered tales began forming almost immediately, shaping the legacy of the men who fought and fell. These stories would move from village to village, from monastery to noble court, weaving themselves into the identity of a people whose world had changed forever. The immediate aftermath of Kosovo left the region suspended between loss and recalibration. The battle had ended, but its consequences had only begun to unfold. And as the dust settled over the plain, the Balkans entered a new and uncertain chapter, one defined by shifting allegiances, rising powers, and the long shadow cast by a single day of war. Days turned into weeks, and the shock of Kosovo began rippling through every court, fortress, and mountain valley across the Balkans. What had happened on the plain was no longer just a battle. It had become the pivot on which the region's entire future began to turn. Survivors carried the memory of the clash into the lands beyond the Morava and Drina, telling stories shaped by where they had stood, what they had seen, and, most of all, what they had lost. These accounts, fragmented and raw, formed the earliest foundation of how each realm interpreted the battle's meaning. Across Serbia, the weight of leadership rested on Milica, who faced obligations that pressed in from every direction. Delegations from local nobles filled her halls, each seeking guidance or offering advice colored by their own interests. Some argued for submitting to Bayezid at once, warning that refusal would invite devastation. Others urged resistance, claiming that the remnants of the army could regroup with foreign support. Each viewpoint reflected the fear and uncertainty settling over the land. Melissa listened to all, yet her decisions required more than sentiment. They demanded calculation, grounded in the harsh new reality. News from the north added urgency. Reports arrived of Hungarian forces moving toward the frontier. Testing the weakened border with raids meant to gauge Serbia's strength. Towns along the Danube fortified their walls, preparing for conflict from a direction they had not expected so soon. After the devastation in Kosovo, militia traded messages with local commanders, urging restraint where possible, defense where necessary. With no unified army left to rely on, she had to preserve every ounce of stability even as the broader political landscape continued shifting beneath her feet. In the months after the battle, delegations from the Ottoman court appeared before her. Bayezid's envoys spoke with directness that left little room for negotiation. Serbia would acknowledge Ottoman supremacy, provide tribute, and accept terms that secured Bayezid's position while preserving a measure of internal autonomy. Milica knew the alternative meant devastation. Her acceptance was not a gesture of surrender, but a strategic choice meant to preserve what remained of her people. Through these agreements, Serbia's integration into the Ottoman sphere began, not through conquest alone, but through necessity, shaped by the loss of Kosovo. Brankovic, whose cavalry had escaped the battlefield, watched these developments with measured caution. From his fortified estates, he weighed his options carefully. His forces remained stronger than those of other nobles, but his position had grown complicated. While some praised him for preserving a fighting contingent, others whispered doubts about his motives during the battle. His survival became a double-edged legacy, one that gave him leverage but also required constant defense of his actions. He maintained distance from Milica's court, while communicating enough to avoid outright conflict. In time, his decisions would carry lasting consequences for the region. Bosnia confronted its own reckoning. Tvutko, informed through Vukovic's surviving officers, presented the battle as a testament to Bosnian valor. He emphasized the courage of those who fought under the banner he had sent, shaping a narrative that softened the blow of the coalition's defeat. Yet in private, he recognized the shifting balance of power. Bosnia's borders, though intact, now stood closer to an empire that had proven its capacity to wage war on a scale few could match. Tvutko's court increased garrison strength along vulnerable passes, preparing for a future shaped by uncertainty. Wallachia, Albania, and the remaining Balkan principalities reached their own conclusions. Some saw opportunity in the power vacuum left by the coalition's collapse. Others strengthened defenses, wary that the Ottoman push into Serbia marked the beginning of further advances. Across these territories, monks and chroniclers recorded the battle with solemn tones, often relying on accounts carried by merchants and wandering soldiers. Their writings, though shaped by distance from the event, added layers to the growing tapestry of stories that would define how Kosovo was remembered. Meanwhile, Bayezid acted with urgency to cement his authority. In the months following his father's death, he promoted commanders who had proven steadfast and replaced those whose loyalties he questioned. Garrisons across the Balkans received new leadership. Supplies flowed into frontier towns. Roads were repaired to ensure swift movement of armies in the future. Every measure reinforced the message that the empire remained united, its leadership secure despite the loss of Murad. Within this consolidation, Bayezid recognized the value of maintaining certain local structures. Rather than imposing abrupt control, he relied on agreements that bound lords to his authority while allowing them to govern their own territories. This approach extended the empire's reach without provoking immediate rebellion. The weight of Kosovo had demonstrated that complete resistance could bring ruin. Now, diplomacy filled the gaps that force had opened. The landscape itself bore marks of the transition. Markets adjusted to the presence of Ottoman troops moving through the region. Farmers rebuilt fields damaged during the battle or abandoned by those who had fled. Monasteries offered shelter to refugees displaced by the fighting, compiling lists of the missing and performing rites for those confirmed dead. In villages, elders recounted the battle to children too young to understand its scale, describing the way the sun rose over the plain that morning and the silence that followed the final clash. Songs began to circulate, carried by travelers who moved between towns and courts. Some celebrated the bravery of those who had stood against overwhelming odds. Others mourned the fall of leaders whose legacies now rested on the memories of those who had witnessed their final moments. These stories grew with each retelling, gaining depth, symbolism, and emotional tone. Though the details varied, the memory of Kosovo became larger than the battle itself, a reflection of loss, identity, and endurance. Serbia, under Milica's guidance, settled into a new arrangement defined by survival rather than ambition. Tribute flowed southward. Envoys traveled frequently between her court and Bayezid's. Her son grew under the watchful guidance of both family advisors and political realities shaped by forces beyond their borders. In time, he would inherit a realm transformed, its choices shaped by the necessity she confronted in the wake of Kosovo. As the first winter after the battle approached, the region's political map had shifted markedly. Ottoman influence stretched deeper into the Balkans. Local rulers adjusted to the new order. And the memory of Kosovo Polje, its vast plain, once filled with banners, dust, and steel, took root as a defining moment in the consciousness of the peoples who called the region home. The immediate aftermath had ended, but what followed would define generations. Each decision made in those early months set paths that would not converge again. From the courts of Serbia to the palaces of Edirne, from the fortified towns of Bosnia to the monasteries, recording their chronicles by candlelight. The impact of Kosovo reverberated through every corner of the Balkans. One battle had ended. An era had begun.